Hi, you're listening to the Stephan Livera podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Today, for episode 179, my guest is Ergo. Ergo first appeared on the show on episode 130, so some of you may enjoy that one. And also some other relevant episodes are 149 with Waxwing, 150 with Samourai Wallet, 165 with Raphael Jacobi, and 167 with Chris Belcher. In this one, we get a little more technical and into the detail on how Ergo was able to unwind certain coin joins. But first, a word for the sponsors of the show. So firstly, my lead sponsor, Swan Bitcoin. Now, disclosure, I do hold a small equity stake in Swan Bitcoin, but if you are in the US, you absolutely should get your auto stacking on with Swan. The process is so simple, even a no-coiner could do it. You auto fund the USD from your bank account, you auto stack the Bitcoin, and then you automatically withdraw it to your cold storage. So Swan doesn't charge withdrawal fees, they want you to hold your own keys. Swan also crushes Coinbase's fees for recurring buys by up to 80% and beat Cash App fees by up to 57%. Set and forget, just Swan and chill. Go to swanbitcoin.com/Livera to start auto stacking with Swan today. Be sure to use my ref link, swanbitcoin.com/Livera, and you get $10 worth of BTC dropped into your account when you start stacking with Swan. Next up is Unchained Capital, Bitcoin financial services with products and services built on the foundation of multisig. So if you're looking for a way to set up multisig and you don't want to get too technical into it, Unchained have an easy web vault setup. You can use 2 Trezors or 1 Trezor and 1 Ledger, and you can set up a 2 of 3 setup where Unchained will be the third key in that scenario. So this is a great way to secure your Bitcoin for the longer term. And also, if you need liquidity, if you want to loan but you don't want to sell your Bitcoin, you can put up some Bitcoin as collateral. And that Bitcoin is then stored on-chain in dedicated multi-sig addresses, and it's never rehypothecated. Also, Unchained have all these open source tools and content on their blog, so you can find that at unchained-capital.com. They've got Hermit and they've got Caravan, and check out my recent episode with Parker Lewis and Buck Purley talking about Caravan and how you can use it and what scenarios it might be handy for you. So go and check out Unchained Capital. The website is unchained-capital.com. For those of you in the UK, or if you have pre-coiner or new coiner friends in the UK, check out CoinFloor. They went Bitcoin only last year, and they just recently launched AutoBuy, a service letting anyone stack sats hands-free. It's quick and setup is really easy. So CoinFloor have also launched one of the most competitive affiliate schemes in the Bitcoin space. It's a 39-month scheme that can let you generate a Bitcoin income by referring new or existing CoinFloor customers to AutoBuy. The only criteria is that they've not been previously referred. The website for that is coinfloor.co.uk. Lastly, Bitcoin lessons. Bitcoin education still has some way to go, and if you want an easy mobile application that you can give to your pre-coiner or new coiner friends, they've got it on Apple and Android, and it walks the newcomer through Bitcoin in a journey. It's like Duolingo. They basically get to learn about Bitcoin in bite-sized pieces, and they complete little quizzes and lessons and learn about Bitcoin in that way, and they link out to different podcasts and articles and so on, and they're also Bitcoin only. This app is by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners. There is zero interest in altcoins, and it's Bitcoin, not crypto. So that's the mission. So go and check them out. It's bitcoinlessons.org, and you can get it on the Google and Apple app stores also. Here's the interview. Hi, Ergo. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Stephan. Thanks for having me back.
It's great to chat with you, and I know you've been doing a lot of awesome work, so I'm really excited to get into it and discuss with you. So I know you've got 2 reports that you have put out recently with OXT Research. So let's start with the China and North Korea one. So it's called the North Korean Connection. What spurred this analysis?
So I guess in early March, the IRS, the DOJ, and the FBI took some legal action against 2 Chinese nationals. And as a part of the legal actions, they published some relatively detailed chain analysis. We saw this go by in a couple of news articles. We got our hands on the official court documents and kind of took it from there.
It mentions the Lazarus Group. So who are they?
The Lazarus Group is, I guess, a somewhat infamous North Korean hacker group. They're allegedly behind a lot of malware incidents, hacks, thefts, and other kinds of issues. We've seen, multiple hacks of South Korean exchanges in, I don't want to say recent years, maybe not since 2018 or so. No, that's not true. 2019, we had one as well. But we've seen multiple, exchange hacks, in South Korea. And they're usually, we'll see a news report go by that attributes, possibly to Lazarus Group. We don't usually get much details. It's usually behind probably, the government security services. But in this case, we finally started to get a little bit more details on that. In the Lazarus Group report, like I said, we saw the news reports go by, and we got our hands on the actual, complaint filing. On first reading, there was a couple things that we noticed that were, either omitted or, kind of stood out to us as something that we probably wanted to check on. The first thing that stood out to us was the use of the term peeling chain. You might see us use that from time to time in reference to just sort of a typical Bitcoin transaction graph. And for kind of the listeners that aren't familiar with that terminology, a peeling chain typically is a string of multiple transactions, typically with one input and two outputs. And depending on the size of the outputs, you can sort of get an idea of which output was the change based on some common heuristics and which output was the payment. So this report, which was filed by the DOJ, the IRS, and the FBI, this was the first time that we've seen them use a somewhat technical kind of Bitcoin transaction graph term, and that kind of immediately stood out to me. I know that the IRS cybercrime investigation unit was involved in this. A lot of these organizations, they have access to the mainstream chain analysis software, but that terminology sort of really stood out to us. It either means A, they're more advanced than we kind of assume, or they're getting help from the chain analysis firms, and I'm fairly certain it's a combination of both. They're very likely, even if the chain analysis firms aren't doing the actual analysis, it's very likely that they're at least aiding the government agencies, via consulting or some other type of assistance.
Right, and as I understand, even companies like Chainalysis and these chain surveillance companies or surveillance companies are some of them have government contracts, and it may well be that they had a contract to teach government employees about chain surveillance, right? And how to, what is a peel chain, what is, a coin join, and all these terms. So with bringing it back to this particular complaint, in the document or in your report as well, you mentioned about how there were these what they call virtual currency accounts. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and where did those accounts come from?
So the complaint formally it names two Chinese nationals, but it claims forfeiture of assets belonging to virtual currency accounts. That includes, anywhere from, Bitcoin addresses or ETH addresses to accounts directly held, by the, associated entities at major exchanges. So the complaint seeks forfeiture of those direct accounts. The complaint also, it references the virtual currency exchanges as pseudonyms. It doesn't directly name who was hacked and any of the other exchanges that were involved. Instead, it just uses numbers. Like I think it uses VCE1, Virtual Currency Exchange 1, or the Exchange 1 to reference who was hacked and sort of where funds went. So after our first perusal of the paper, we wanted to figure out who was hacked, what does the complaint attribute to who, and then where did the funds go, to try to get behind some of these pseudonyms. So as far as hacked exchanges, I think we were looking at Upbit. Let me actually pull up the report.
We've got Ubit, CoinRail, and BitThumb.
There we go, exactly. And some of those are major Korean exchanges. Upbit, and BitThumb. CoinRail was one that I had actually never heard of at the time, and seemed to be sort of more of an altcoin, smaller hack. But the complaint goes into various details about the process of how the hack happened at each exchange, And for the most part, what it alleges is social engineering attacks. Emails were sent to exchange, parties. Malicious links were opened, and the hackers apparently gained access to the exchange's private keys and were able to extract funds.
Right, and so I guess if I had to just summarize what's going on here, it's essentially that this hacker group called the Lazarus Group, the story seems to be that they have found ways to hack some of these exchanges over the period of 2018 to 2019, and then they typically lie in wait for some time, right? It's like they're a hacker, they've stolen some bitcoins, and then they wait, and then they're looking for a way to launder that money or sort of send it through an exchange and then try to pull it out as fiat. Would you say that's kind of a high level, that's what's going on here?
Yeah, that's a good overview. And what we saw generally in the complaint was this basically happened in three phases, which you sort of just described. Number one is the initial hack, followed by what looked like peel chains to various intermediary exchanges. The peel chains, they obfuscate slightly the transfer of funds. And what they do, at least, in our opinion and basically the opinion of whoever, authored the complaint, is that these are ways of circumventing, the exchange compliance software. Rather than depositing, all 1,000 stolen Bitcoin in one transaction, it's done over, a few dozen and smaller amounts. This will sort of avoid some of the flags that might get raised from, exchanges. So they'll, do the hack, peel to a first round of exchanges. In our opinion, they treat the second round of exchanges sort of as custodial tumblers. They used, the exchanges operate a shared wallet. Funds will go in, one address or one wallet and might leave from another. And it's very hard to keep track of funds from that point on, since the exchanges are operating shared wallets. So after the funds are withdrawn, then they're peeled to a third round of exchanges, where it looked like the conspirators were trying to cash out, either fiat or gift cards.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It's a very mysterious story, right? So let's, I guess, dive into a little bit further detail on what's going on here. So perhaps first, maybe you could just explain the difference for the listeners. What is the difference between a custodial tumbler and then, what we know as the non-custodial coin join? If you could explain that, please.
Yeah, so we've blurred the lines between the difference between a custodial tumbler and a non-custodial coin join. The term mixer has become, used generically for both terms, but they are, inherently different. And like you had said, tumblers were some of the first obfuscation techniques that were available to Bitcoiners. And these were custodial. They took control of users' private keys. They effectively operated a shared wallet, and they dispersed funds at, some irregular, interval after the initial deposit. So again, tumblers are custodial. They take control of the user's private keys, and they can get a little bit creative with how they disperse the funds. Whereas a non-custodial coin join, which is, sort of the Samourai Whirlpool, JoinMarket, and Wasabi Wallet, the things that most Bitcoiners are now sort of have become used to over the last, year or so, those are non-custodial. And, they have to operate, slightly differently. Because they're non-custodial, typically the funds in a coin join transaction are returned to the user in the same transaction as a user makes an input. So a coin join relies on math, whereas a tumbler can rely on its custodial properties to obfuscate fund transfer.
Yep. And then in terms of ways that someone like yourself, a white hat chain analyst, can attack or try to unmix or unwind a tumbler, is it essentially relying on things like timing analysis to see that, 1,000 bitcoins went in and 1,000 bitcoins came out? Or what are some of the ways that you would try to assess this?
Yeah, so depending on the tumbler, each one sort of operates a little bit differently. Funds aren't necessarily returned to the user in the same transaction like they are in a coin join. And that's what we mean by, a custodial tumbler can offer some better privacy than, a traditional coin join if kind of done properly. In a coin join, we know that the funds are returned in the same transaction. So we can just monitor, the outflows from that transaction to try to, correlate with the user. Whereas a custodial tumbler, we're looking at potentially any number of transactions in the future that could possibly be, attributable to the original deposit.
Yep. And I guess just one other point I wanted to touch on, just with the peel chains as well, because I think it's useful to go over that as well. So I think this is one of those dynamics where, for some time before chain analysis became a thing, people thought they were able to obfuscate just by doing these sort of less sophisticated obfuscation techniques, right? And using I think you've used the term previously, is like self-shuffling, and just kind of this idea of splitting off and carving out little chunks of your Bitcoin, and then like those little babushka dolls, every little piece becomes smaller. So it's sort of like that's kind of like what the peel chain is, and essentially these the Lazarus Group guys and potentially other people are using peel chains, thinking they're being more anonymous or more private. But I guess the reality is, to a more sophisticated analyst, they can pick that apart, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. If you or an analyst kind of sees a large volume, starting transaction, originating from an exchange, depending on how many transactions are done, if you just follow the end of that peel chain, and you see where each of those outputs goes along the way, you can start to kind of come to the conclusion that this is the same entity sending coins to the same place. And with just looking at a standard block explorer, it becomes more difficult to see. You might see a reused address as one of the payment destinations, but when you take a look at this as a transaction graph, on OXT, and of course a lot of the mainstream chain analysis firms have something similar. The peel chain becomes even more obvious, where you'll see a very clear, small, chipping away, kind of as you described. And so, for a period of time, when these chain analysis firms likely didn't exist, maybe this could have been used as a technique to, try to obfuscate funds. But now it seems that analysis firms have gotten, a good bit more in tune to what methods Bitcoiners can use.
Yep. And so with the understanding which exchanges it's going to, and I presume that's also because people have different goals when they're using Bitcoin, right? And so some people using Bitcoin don't care about privacy. That's just the straight reality. So there are some people who will not be using these kinds of, Stonewall spends and so on, and it may not be possible to do these kinds of spends for large wallets. And so I think that's why the reality is many exchanges, they have like a known cold wallet, and that can be tagged and clustered, would you say?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm sure the mainstream chain analysis firms are, if they're not directly working with exchanges, getting provided information, they're going out and they're seeding entities. And what I mean by seeding entities is, creating an account at XYZ KYC Lite exchange to try to tag their clusters there. So if they aren't collaborating, there are certainly ways to try to get labels on a lot of these exchanges.
Right, and I think it may well be that even just with publicly available information, in some cases you can see, this, or if you received a payment from somebody, and then you can sort of start to see, okay, this came from the Binance, like if I trace this back enough, this came from Binance, or this came from Coinbase, or whatever exchange, right? And so I guess just for listeners, in your mind, understand that when you send a Bitcoin transaction, you're sending that to a particular address, but then if the analyst is able to trace it back to see what was the source of that money, or where did it eventually end up, then that's the way that these clustering behaviors can be done to try and understand, okay, that's kind of the layout of the land, that, okay, this little area here, that's the Coinbase cluster, and this little area there, that's some other exchange cluster, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. All right, so then I think the next question people would have is, how was it that you were able to tell the money once it went through the custodial tumbler? So I think that's coming back to what you were saying around like timing analysis and so on, because normally people would say, okay, once you've kind of gone inside the exchange and then they went back out the exchange, how do you would have lost the trail then? How did you trace it through there?
Well, so there's we haven't quite gotten to the custodial tumbler part of the Lazarus Group analysis yet. Um, we're sort of documenting the phases that the IRS describes in the complaint. So phase one was hack and peel to a first round of KYC kind of light exchanges. They then use those KYC light exchanges as basically custodial tumblers, and then peeled for a third time to fiat off-ramp exchanges. And so I don't know exactly what the IRS did to acquire the information of how they went from KYC light exchange to their fiat exit. I'm going to guess that they have labels on the KYC light exchanges, and they serve some subpoenas or reached out to these exchanges and asked for information. They certainly have in the complaint, they certainly have account names, email addresses, pseudonyms, and a couple other identifying information that they could only really get directly from the exchange. So I'm assuming that they reached out to the exchanges from there and said, okay, we saw that these funds went in. These transactions were associated with the original hacks. Are these transactions then associated with any ID? Those IDs were provided, and then they watched the funds move to the fiat exit, and they likely basically repeated the same process.
Yeah, I see. And so essentially the IRS or the DOJ or FBI would have gone and asked that exchange saying, hey, XYZ exchange, we know this address at this time, it came in. Who is that deposit for? Do you have an ID underlying that person on your exchange? And then they would ask for that info.
Yeah, correct. And you can even see in the complaint they have some of these ridiculous KYC, fake photos with the alleged conspirators. Basically used doctored photos, fake passports, fake T-shirt models with the same T-shirt but a different face. So there's certainly a ways around KYC that these guys are aware of, and they certainly do. But when it was sort of all said and done, the complaint documents the hacking process. It documents how much fiat that they were able to cash out at the attributed second phase of exchanges, and then from there the complaint mentions only once another cluster that did not get sent to an exchange, and instead what they say is the funds were mixed, and that was basically the end of that sort of paragraph or that portion of the complaint. So I then followed the funds from the cluster that was mentioned into Chip Mixer, the custodial tumbler, which is probably one of the more well-known and more used tumblers. And from there, we can circle back to, okay, how did I track funds across Chip Mixer? And we had already sort of given that little bit of background about the difference between a coin join and a custodial tumbler. The custodial tumbler won't necessarily return funds, in the same transaction that a user, has an input in. So there's a second hop, at least in the way that Chip Mixer works, where the initial transaction in Chip Mixer they're trying to make look like a fake coin join. They'll take a handful of inputs, and then they'll spit them out in certain denominations, and they're all I think factors of 2 of some base 256 number. I can't remember which ones exactly, but they effectively they look like coin joins, but they're not. So there'll be a second transaction after the fake kind of coin joins in Chip Mixer, in which the funds are then returned to the user. And so what I saw was that there was about 160 Bitcoin that was sent to basically all to the same mix and all originated from the conspirators, pre-mix cluster. And there's one other difference between a custodial tumbler and a non-custodial coin join, is that obviously there's the risk of fund loss associated with a custodial tumbler. So users aren't likely to keep their funds on a custodial tumbler for a very long amount of time. They likely are trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. And so what I saw was a significant volume basically heading out from the same transaction as the funds came in. Just one hop removed because of the custodial nature. And from there, I was able to follow the funds to various destinations.
Yeah, that's really incredible stuff. And so it sort of comes to that idea of you're kind of using logic to understand, well, okay, this is a custodial service. These people do not want to leave funds on there any longer than they must. So they're going to try to pull them out. And then as I read from your report, you've leveraged some additional metadata, things like, as we mentioned earlier, the volume correlation aspects, and then also there were certain common inputs and destinations, and then those were what enabled you to tie these together and understand that, oh, this looks like it's actually the same actor, even though there's some obfuscation going on the chain.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there's a couple other things that can be done to de-anonymize the flows across either a coin join or a custodial tumbler. The worst being is the combination of basically pre-mix funds and post-mix funds, and I saw that here as well. It was in one small occurrence, but it sort of kind of tied a lot of the picture together. Okay, this is very likely the same entity that controls funds on both sides of this chip mixer.
And so just for listeners who are unfamiliar, I guess that concept of pre-mix and post-mix. So pre-mix is basically your wallet that you were dealing with before trying to go through all this mix stuff. And then what's happened in this case is withdrawing it out from the custodial tumbler actually came back, which is like a post-mix, that actually came back into that pre-mix cluster. And that's what you're saying enables you to tie it together, right?
Yeah, correct.
Awesome. And then, so in terms of the context, just for the numbers, it looks like the complaint says 67 million of withdrawals from the noted exchanges to Chinese banks, and additionally another 1.5 million in iTunes gift cards using Paxful peer-to-peer exchange. So that's interesting, isn't it? And I think it's funny that people try to say, like, like if there are people who speak bad about, say, coin joining, but in reality people can still sort of use exchanges almost as a custodial tumbler of sorts, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. And so the complaint kind of fingers peel chains as the obfuscation technique. And while that certainly was an obfuscation technique used, I mean, as we've sort of discussed and as the IRS clearly shows, peel chains are easily trackable, if you're going to sit down and take the time to do sort of a more in-depth analysis. So, in our opinion, the sort of the KYC light exchanges were served as more of the general obfuscation technique. They basically acted as custodial tumblers on chains, and they required the IRS to go out and start knocking on doors and asking for additional information if they wanted to continue this tracking process. And I guess it's also worth noting that one of the major destinations of these coins was Huobi, where the conspirators were effectively trying to cash out into fiat. We keep running into Huobi in a lot of our analyses.
Yeah, you definitely have to ask that question, right? So in this context, what does KYC light mean?
So there's always, we always try to advocate for, no KYC. And if there's sort of no such thing as no KYC. You always are dealing with some kind of a counterparty. Even if you're just trading with your friend, they know that they sold you coins. But on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have sort of the Coinbase, where they're, taking your a picture of you holding your driver's license, your bank account information, social security number, and they're basically now using all of that to sell to the government. And everything in between, sort of falls on some kind of a spectrum. And so some exchanges, they don't require anything, from users. All they need is an email address. that might be, considered KYC information. And as we sort of saw in this report, you know, even just the having an email address can be sort of used kind of against people. But what we mean by sort of KYC light is an exchange that doesn't require you to give passport, driver's license, bank account, kind of any other information. The KYC light exchanges tend to be exchanges that, they're basically shitcoin casinos. They don't have fiat banking ties. So they're not required to really take any of that information.
I'm also interested to talk a little bit about some of the different approaches that these people are using. So as we've discussed, they used chip mixer going through Huobi, and it looks like they've also used Wasabi. So can you tell us a little bit about their efforts there?
Yeah. So, again, where the complaint kind of leaves off, it identifies, several hundred Bitcoin in a cluster, and then effectively says the coins were mixed, and the report basically stops. I just described the process of the mixing through chip mixer, but what we've also found was that funds from the conspirators cluster were merged with a very large separate entities cluster, which has been providing a significant amount of liquidity to Wasabi for, basically since the end of last year. This was sort of the first hint at, an identification of who this entity might be. We have a couple of ideas based on some of the information that was provided in the report or in the complaint about what the entity might be. But basically from there, we got our first kind of idea that, these guys may also be using Wasabi.
And if they're using Wasabi, what are some of the techniques that they may be using, and what are some of the ways that you were essentially able to tie them together?
Yeah, so, again, a lot of, the attacks on CoinJoins tend to be based on volume and timing. The problem with sending such a large amount of volume, through a relatively small volume, CoinJoin, is that you tend to stand out. And so, that tends to be one of the biggest things, that these guys do wrong. It's what we saw with Plus Token, and is kind of what we see again here. An entity depositing several hundred Bitcoin within the space of, a day or two, and then withdrawing them all effectively to the same place, is kind of what we see. One of the other issues that I've sort of, for the first time was able to document in this case was, the address reuse that these guys have been basically suffering from in the Wasabi mixer is pretty bad. And what I've for the first time was able to see was, an unmixed change output basically get paid to a mixed output address, which effectively de-anonymizes, the post-mix spend without the user having to do anything.
That's very unfortunate, and it also impacts the privacy of the other people in that mix, because now there's less entities who are unknown, right? Because some of them have been tied together.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's not just these guys shouldn't have been reusing addresses. I doubt that they were trying to de-anonymize themselves, but it sort of happens, and it does affect kind of everyone.
So these are some of the, I guess, design flaws that you've called out here in the report around Wasabi. So you've mentioned the peeling style, peel chain, the address reuse, and then also the post-mix spending tools, or rather the lack of post-mix spending tools. So what are you getting at there with the lack of post-mix spending tools? Why is that important?
Yeah, so to document at least a little bit of what the process was that I saw here again is the entity mixes their coins. They get a bunch of mixed outputs in whatever the current denomination is, some flavor of 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, etc. And then they're returned a change output in that kind of same transaction. And if the change output is paid to the same address as a mixed output, it effectively de-anonymizes that mixed output. It's pretty simple. Then that change output will be remixed and kind of continue on and hopefully not, get sucked into any more address reuse. But, it's technically not a cluster in sort of the formal sense, but, when a change output is paid to a mixed output address, it's basically a cluster precursor. And then, the cluster will sort of survive on the way out of the mixer, just based on normal kind of post-mix spending habits where people will tend to consolidate, a couple of mixed outputs at the same time. And so when we say, kind of post-mix tools, how important those kind of can be, a sort of formal post-mix tool that would break that cluster, would at least make that, somewhat more difficult to track. At least the cluster hopefully wouldn't grow, in which case it sort of does here.
Okay, so just want to make sure I've understood you correctly there. So essentially what we're talking about here is once you've gone through the mix, you've got your coin sitting on the other side. And if you don't have the right tool set when you're spending out of that, you may inadvertently join the wrong pieces together. And is that also related to the concept of an input merge?
Yeah, it is kind of related. So, an input merge sort of goes back to the traditional terminology for a cluster, the common input ownership heuristic, where for the majority of Bitcoin's history, spends that included multiple inputs can basically be assumed to be the same entity. And again, this is a heuristic, but when we say post-mix spending is then merging multiple inputs on the way out of the mixer, we're then sort of formalizing that cluster by kind of the common input ownership heuristic.
Gotcha. And you also noted here the use of multiple mixing clients with Wasabi. So what's the implication there for users?
Yeah, we had seen sort of at least kind of two phases that might be attributable to the conspirators. One in which they were running up to kind of six mixing clients at the same time, and the second phase, which was I think at least two. And so just sort of based on the way that Wasabi operates their fee structure, what this number one does is it inflates everyone's fees. Fees are calculated proportional to the number of participants, or in this case, the number of mixing clients. And then, so users are basically paying an inflated, price for a somewhat lower quality mix, especially if then those coins are, then merged on the way out and attributable all to the same entity.
You also note here around unequal amounts. So I guess for listeners who may not have used Wasabi, the idea is if you have put in, so I think the typical minimum amount is 0.1 BTC or 10 million sats. But if you put in more than that, it will then progressively sort of cut that down into unequal sizes. So is there a problem there in terms of unequal amount mixing in your view?
When we think of mixing, Wasabi was one of the first to kind of popularize the term anonymity set. That's the number of identical outputs, after the mix has been completed. And when we say kind of unequal mixing amounts, what we're kind of referring to is on the input side. An entity that's obviously depositing, a very large amount directly into the CoinJoin transaction will tend to stand out. And then, based on the actual unequal mixing denominations that Wasabi sort of, imposes, there's a 0.1, a 0.2, 0.4, and so on that will double depending on, the size of the inputs that are available. And what you'll kind of see is that, on the higher end of those outputs, those are almost always attributable to only a handful of entities on the input side. And that's what we mean by kind of, the unequal mixing amounts being a problem.
Right. I guess put in other words, it's simply that there are just not that many kind of rich entities who are putting in, 10 BTC inputs. And so because of that, it really dramatically reduces your actual anon set of how many people are able to deposit that kind of size in. And then that is kind of the clue or the string that you can pull on to understand, oh, wait, this might be this this particular entity or this conspirator, for example.
Yeah, that's correct. That's exactly what we mean.
Yeah. And also, you mentioned here this concept of structural liquidity enforcement. So what are you getting at with that idea?
So there is effectively no structural liquidity requirement to trigger a mix, at least in Wasabi and I think even in JoinMarket as well. And what do I mean by that is that there's, if enough people get together, the mix will basically trigger. It doesn't need to be new incoming liquidity into the mixer. It could basically just be recycled liquidity, which will sort of transition us to kind of the next report. The way that Wasabi at least works is there's a timer. If the timer goes off, the mix triggers, regardless of whether or not there was new liquidity inbound or not. And again, kind of the same sort of philosophy applies to JoinMarket.
Yeah. And I guess the other the other rejoinder may be that you can remix the unmixed change. And I guess some of this is spilling over into the second report. Maybe we should discuss the second report and then discuss this general idea of unmixed change and how do we deal with it. So you've got this other report here called the toxic recall attack. So what's going on here? What is a toxic recall attack?
A few weeks ago, we saw an old Reddit post kind of get recycled for the first time in a few years. And so we dug a little bit into the Reddit post. Apparently, a user claims to have had their web wallet hacked. The coins were removed from their web wallet to allegedly a wallet controlled by the hackers. The coins again sat for I think a year and a half or so, and then eventually were mixed through JoinMarket. And so the entity mixed two separate UTXOs. One was for 45 BTC, the other one was for 400 BTC. And the way that this sort of the way to kind of describe unmixed change is that on the input side of a transaction, JoinMarket or Wasabi will allow the user to directly deposit into kind of that directly into the mix. So for example, if we have 45 BTC entering entering a JoinMarket mix, the mix denomination is 1 BTC. The 45 BTC input will get a 44 BTC unmixed change output and a 1 BTC mixed output. So when we're referring to unmixed change, we're referring to that kind of monotonically decreasing unmixed change output. And what we can kind of see is that over multiple transactions, that monotonic decrease will kind of continue as the unmixed change is sort of peeled through the coin join.
And so I guess what you're getting at here is also the use of, so in the Samourai Whirlpool model, you're getting at this idea that the TX0, that sort of pre-mix step, is what helps get rid of that problem, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean that's basically exactly what it does. Is it creates those sort of homogeneous or relatively homogeneous inputs. At least in the TX0 model, the premixers they're a little bit larger inputs than the pool denomination because they're paying the miner fee. It's technically impossible to have identical inputs on the input and output side of a coin join transaction. Someone has to pay the miner fee, but at least with the TX0 model, this unmixed change problem is removed directly from the mix. The unmixed change gets kind of kept separate and in the premix wallet.
Right, and I suppose someone could potentially, the rejoinder might be something like, well, that's more costly because you're having to do an additional transaction. And I presume the response would be basically, well, stiff, that's the only way to do this, right?
Yeah, it's it's the closest thing that we have to an ideal coin join. And you've gotta gotta wait, and you've gotta pay to do it.
So you're right. That would be so. It takes a little bit longer to do it because now you've got to wait for this TX0 to clear through, and then your actual coin join can occur. So that's kind of comparing some of the different models in terms of coin joining. So I guess bringing it back to this JoinMarket case study. So there's a user Grid Chain. So they did a Reddit post saying, "Oh look, I lost 445 BTC. I'm offering a bounty if you can track it down." And so in this story, it looks like those BTC were sitting for 1.5 years. So, I mean, a common story with some of these hacks is they'll do the hack and then they'll just sit on the coins for a little while before then they try to run it through a mix. And so in this story, it looks like they tried to go through JoinMarket for their mixing, and then your analysis was essentially able to try and unwind some components of the mix and understand where did those coins end up afterwards. So can you tell us a little bit about how you did that, and what was the story there?
Yeah. So we sort of described the peeling nature of unmixed change. I gave a little bit of an example, and I said, two separate UTXOs were mixed, allegedly mixed from Grid Chain's original holdings, a 45 BTC UTXO and a 400 BTC UTXO. Now the 45 BTC UTXO doesn't stand out quite as much as the 400 BTC UTXO, and that sort of presents problem number one. That's a very obvious peel chain when you have 400 BTC on the input side. You have a 1 BTC mix output and a 399 BTC change. This sort of becomes obvious. And I'm trying to describe a visual process, which is the transaction graph, and how the 400 BTC will slowly get chipped away at over time, or as mixes continue. So definitely go check out the report. The visuals will absolutely help this explanation. So we followed the 400 BTC input basically across the mixer as it was slowly peeled down and mixed. And what we saw was there were, sort of three separate regimes of kind of mixing. The first, where the 400 BTC input was acting as a market maker in JoinMarket, providing liquidity. They were getting a lot of much smaller outputs, in the order of 1 BTC, and then a period where they began to act as the taker, to try to, at least based on what I could tell, try to mix their coins a little bit faster. And so instead of offering liquidity, they began taking liquidity. And they began taking liquidity in a very kind of very large amount. The average mixed output before and after before as they were acting as the maker, I think was around 5 BTC or 9 BTC. And as they were acting as the taker, jumped to around 25. It's just to kind of show the difference, in regimes there. And during the taker regime, there aren't that many people that are offering that kind of liquidity. And so what we saw was the same, handful of outputs that were capable of providing the liquidity that the alleged thief of Grid Chain's coins was demanding in the taker model. And so we saw basically the recycling of the same coins that followed along with the unmixed change. And that sort of introduced us into the toxic recall attack.
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating story, and I think it's really, really cool analysis that you were able to do, because it sounds to me like no one else has done this up until recently. I think yourself, and I think Laurent MT also mentioned some of this stuff when I saw some of your earlier discussion on Twitter, saying, "Oh, hold on a sec, there might be a bit more to this story than we first thought, and actually you can de-anonymize some of that."
Yeah, so I mean the hard assumptions here that kind of kick off the analysis are, number one, I know I'm looking at a JoinMarket transaction, right? That may or may not be the case. There's ways to confirm that. You can go and you can check the order book, which at least is what we saw on the Reddit post. Users going, yeah, we confirm this. I see these mixes go by in my order book. And then kind of the next level of assumption is that I know how the mixer works. and I know what it's doing. And what I mean by that is I know how it treats unmixed change. I know how many inputs from a previous transaction it will accept into a following transaction. And you kind of also have to make the final assumption, which is that the user is only operating one mixing client. And from there, that sort of opens the door for the toxic recall attack, which basically takes that kind of unmixed peel chain, and it says, I know that the owner of the original 400 BTC input is now the owner of this unmixed change output, a half dozen transactions later. And if I know that, and I know that mixed outputs from a previous mix are also sent to that unmixed change output, then I can, by the process of elimination, go back a couple of transactions and eliminate, the mix outputs that get sent to that unmixed change. And the logic being that the recycled outputs that follow along that unmixed change don't belong to the entity that controls the unmixed change. And you can sort of do a process of elimination attack where you had maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, mixed outputs, and depending on how many outputs follow along with that unmixed change, even 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 transactions later, you can cut down the number of possible mixed outputs from a previous mix that could be controlled by that entity.
It's sort of like a process of elimination. And so I think the question would also be around remixing, or in the JoinMarket model, that's the Tumblr script that you might do multiple rounds of mixing. So how does that concept play into this? Basically the question is, does doing lots of rounds of tumbling make it harder for this attack to be successful?
So as long as there is unmixed change kind of present in the mixer, there's a risk that this attack is possible. And again, the attack, at least from this one specific case study, it ranged from an anonymity set that was -1 from the original to completely de-anonymizing an output. And what we saw was that, at least in this case, the de-anonymized output was remixed, even though it was later, eventually likely sent to the same destination. But, kind of the point to circle back to is that as long as the unmixed change is present, this attack remains possible. And again, there's a severity scale of what the attack will actually kind of accomplish. But so how do we get to kind of mitigating, this attack, at least in the current kind of coordinator model that JoinMarket has? And number one is to sort of use, I guess, the pre-Tumbler script, which will, instead of taking that 400 BTC input and peeling it directly through JoinMarket, we'll split it beforehand and make it at least a little bit less obvious. And what this will effectively do is hopefully reduce the number of unmixed change outputs that are attributable to that entity. There still is unmixed change present, but instead of 400 BTC, it's only 5 or 1, and there are only a few peeling chains, in each, as each input is sort of mixed. That will reduce, kind of the likelihood of this attack happening. And then, you get to the actual remix portion. I think the Tumblr script for JoinMarket defaults to anywhere from 7 to 15 remixes. And what we saw was that this entity was not remixing their coins. Well, I shouldn't say not remixing. They were likely participating in 2, kind of at most, in sort of the critical part of this attack, remixes. And what remixing will do will just, again, further reduce the likelihood that you're going to be affected as severely by this attack.
Can we just walk that through one more time? Just with the 400 BTC, essentially you mentioned like a pre-Tumblr script. So what would be occurring at that stage? Like theoretically, this is an idea, right? What would be occurring at that stage to help reduce the possibility of the toxic recall attack?
Yeah, and I think that this actually exists in JoinMarket. Somebody will correct me if this isn't true, but I'm fairly certain that I've heard this mentioned before, that something like this does exist. And I don't know if it's part of the actual Tumblr script or it's called something slightly different, or pre-mixed Tumblr. But anyway, what the theory would be that before you enter the mix, you basically engage in a bunch of peeling chains that will take your 400 BTC and slowly split it across multiple transactions and whittle down from that. Instead of 400, direct deposit into the CoinJoin, the 400 BTC deposit, at some point you'll get to some smaller output amount, let's call it 20 BTC, and that will then eventually be sent into the mixer. And what I mean there then is that if you have only 20 BTC, then you're sort of in this more high liquidity regime. You're less likely to have a very long peel chain. It'll be shorter, and sort of that will mitigate some of the risks of this attack.
I see, yeah. And so I guess you're also getting at this idea that, so similar to what we were saying before, how many people have 400 BTC to mix? Well, not as many as would have 20 BTC to mix. And so there's a bigger group of people who you can, because ultimately it's about hiding in a crowd, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and it sort of gets, to this idea of, how homogenous are the participants of a mix? How similar are they, the inputs and the outputs? And as you get sort of towards that more liquid, range, you tend to blend better with the crowd.
I see. Yeah. And so I guess part of this just relies on the analyst having knowledge of how the coordinator works, and then sort of thinking through the implications of that, and then doing this kind of analysis. And so you're also talking about kind of understanding how the coordinator works. What sort of changes, if any, could be done to how the coordinator works or to how the model works?
And so I sort of explained that, as long as the unmixed change is kind of present, this attack is possible. But, things can be done to mitigate that. And like we said, there's the remixing, the premix tumbling. But there's also one other thing that the coordinator can do, which is to limit the number of previously seen inputs. And what I mean by that is that if we participate in a mix with 5 outputs, and then we have another mix later, only one of the mix outputs from the first mix is allowed to go to the second mix. That will also help sort of mitigate this kind of attack. It doesn't totally eliminate the chances of this, but will reduce kind of the risks again.
As I understand of the Samourai Whirlpool model, there are certain rules in place around how the mix may take place, right? And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know T-Dev often tweets this out, so talking about how no previously seen. That's what you're getting at here, right?
Yep, limited to 1. It changes the transaction graph somewhat significantly. And reduces kind of the chances of this attack. And there's a couple other things that can be done, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, which is liquidity enforcement. And again, I keep coming back to the Whirlpool model because it's one of the only other models that's somewhat different from the JoinMarket and the Wasabi model. And for just sort of users or listeners comparison, in Whirlpool there needs to be at least 2, but up to 3 new inputs that haven't been mixed yet that are required to trigger a mix. And that's what we mean by structural liquidity enforcement. Those 2 or 3 new inputs are from a fresh TX0, are from a new user who just deposited coins into the mixer. And that's what we mean by structural liquidity enforcement, is that we need to have new funds coming into the mixer in order for the mix to trigger, instead of just recycling kind of the same volume, which is what kind of led to this attack, or at least made it worse.
Right, and another question I have on this structural liquidity enforcement, if we consider just broadly, so in the Samourai model, for example, you need, typically it's 3 new mixers and 2 people who are already in the pool and they're just remixing. Is there, and as I understand, I think the Samourai guys have mentioned how they might occasionally switch that the other way to say, okay, we'll allow only 2 new people and then 3 remixes. Is there some kind of implication there that it's kind of difficult for the whole ecosystem to move through? Well, obviously not the whole not all of Bitcoin is going to move through Samourai Whirlpool, right? Obviously, but it makes it difficult for there to be mixes taking place if you're requiring a high number of those people to be quote unquote new mixers. Do you get what I'm trying to get at here?
So if you go back and you read some of the anonymity and mixer research, there's debate about the term latency, which is kind of what we're getting at here. Latency is how long do you have to wait to really get the privacy that you want. And this kind of comes back to the Whirlpool model, which is that we really want to prioritize that privacy as much as possible. And that means, you might have to wait for the new liquidity to come because we've deemed that, a structural necessity for providing, what we consider to be, sufficient anonymity, sufficient privacy. It certainly is a cost. Users certainly do have to wait at times. But when the liquidity is there, the mixes trigger very quickly. So yeah, I mean, we're not going to have all of, Bitcoin users shoving themselves through the Whirlpool mixer anytime soon. But it is a challenge for users who have kind of been trained, to get everything that they want kind of here and now. You're sort of dealing with this, a new problem that a lot of people aren't used to. They're used to, picking up their phone and logging into Twitter and getting what they want kind of immediately. If you throw Tor into the mix, you might have to wait a little while, wait for the relays to open, but even that's still very low latency compared to some of this mixing technology. And so it is important because it's not just about the time that we're kind of used to, the minute to minute. It's about how many transactions are coming in, how quickly are blocks being processed. Users kind of have to get used to waiting a little bit.
It's sort of like there might be a certain population within the Bitcoin world, let's call it 5 or 10% of them who actually care about privacy, and then for those people, they're sort of having to wait for some new fresh blood, if you will. They're having to wait for new coins to come in before they can actually get their mix done. But I suppose over time, there'll be enough of a flow of people kind of moving through the mixer and then doing whatever they say they wanted to spend. And then now they want to come back through, or the other person they spent to, they want to go through the mixer. So that you sort of have to wait for that flow to come through, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I know Whirlpool was designed with sort of a mobile first kind of approach. It's got 5 participants in each mix. Hopefully that should kind of help trigger mixes a bit more quickly. But the other thing people can do is a lot of people, they're not really in a rush to spend, at least not yet. So you can queue up your coins and just wait and let them mix and let it ride. Wait it out. The mixes are happening. They're happening, new record liquidity kind of every month. So it seems to be growing pretty organically. I at least see the number of people, lurking in the Telegram groups, at least in my opinion, seem to be complaining a little bit less about having to wait. As mobile mixing has come out, liquidity has definitely improved.
Of course. And do you have any thoughts on at what point it makes sense to switch over from having enforcing 3 new participants in that mix versus enforcing only 2 new participants in the mix? Do you have any thoughts on when is a good time to switch over for that, or is that just kind of like a subjective judgment call?
I don't know how it's configured at the moment. I'd have to ask TDev and see what the current requirements are. I don't get too hung up on 3 versus 2 right now, as things are sort of still developing. We're still trying to observe how users are behaving, how they're interacting with the service before we kind of get some of these finer details, I guess, ironed out.
Just another point that a skeptic listening might think, well, hang on, you're part of the Samourai team and you're just throwing shit at the competitors. I mean, you have a motive to play up what you feel are design flaws. What would you say in response to that?
I guess first off is I think that we've pretty clearly demonstrated what the flaws are. This has been present in the original CoinJoin technology for some time. And I encourage users, developers, and anybody else to take a look at the work that I've done. Peer review is certainly welcome. Waxwing has been asking Laurent and I a couple of questions on Mastodon, and we've been happy to, kind of walk him through our thought process. So, number one is don't take my word for it. I'd be happy if you go and try to invalidate the analysis, invalidate the attack. That would be great. But I think it's valid. I don't think I'm playing up the implications here. If you read the report, you'll see that there's a range. It's not, the end of the world. So I don't think that we've played up this attack as much as maybe some people will think. And just to definitely reiterate, the JoinMarket team, Chris Belcher and Adam Gibson, they've done a lot for Bitcoin privacy, and they're obviously very, very confident devs, and they wouldn't have gotten involved in Bitcoin privacy if they didn't deeply care. So I think that those guys, they're certainly willing to take a look at some of this stuff and make the changes that they can, or propose something else that hopefully will take care of some of these issues.
Also, unsure if you've had a chance to look much into CoinSwap and whether you believe that would improve the situation.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask. I've given it a read through. I know that we're still sort of at some of the conceptual kind of architecture phase, but it's very exciting tech. It's different from CoinJoin, and at least in my mind. And I don't want to brutalize this too much, as I know Chris Belcher is in the process of sort of getting this kind of worked out. But in my mind, it sort of operates as a non-custodial shared wallet, sort of similar to a Tumbler. You can basically do whatever you want. And it will sever the transaction graph, something that's not possible with CoinJoin. So I sort of look forward to seeing this as it gets, developed further. One of the questions that I at least do have, and hopefully, we'll see get addressed in the, as this thing gets unrolled out, was, the implication that this somehow scales better than, traditional CoinJoin. From my first read of the paper, it looked like there were multiple parties taking part in multiple transactions with multi-sig inputs and multi-sig outputs. And to me, that doesn't pass the major scaling Snell test. Maybe I'm sure someone will tell me, will run the math by me, and explain how this will be better by 50% or something along those lines. But I don't see it being an order of magnitude difference between kind of a traditional CoinJoin. But, as I said, this is sort of in the conceptual phase, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how things develop.
Right. And it could be also, potentially Taproot may make a difference there as well in terms of the cost, in terms of chain space.
Well, you got to read I think I'm sure you've read it, but at least my interpretation was that Belcher was looking to use ECDSA multisig and not move to Taproot. And at least from my interpretation of my reading of the proposal, was that ECDSA has quote unquote a higher anonymity set, because right now we're sort of starting at, Taproot doesn't exist yet. And we'll have to eventually grow into adoption, and who knows what that adoption will look like. So it sounds like he's planning on going with ECDSA, which won't get quite the scaling benefits.
Of course. Agreed there. So thinking about this more broadly, what are some of the implications of this recent chain analysis work for the future of Bitcoin privacy? Are we all screwed?
Yeah, we're at the point where the Monero maximalists will, put pause on the, the podcast and quote tweet this and say, haha, we told you. But privacy will kind of continue to be an uphill battle for Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. Every day privacy gets harder. It's not just in Bitcoin. But again, the chain is entirely transparent. We can't assume that we are the only ones that know about these flaws, and we have to assume that chain analysis and their ilk are also doing the same things, and it's very certain that they are. So the things that we can do are basically do nothing and continue using the systems that we have, dealing with some of the shortcomings and trying to do our best, or we can use the better solutions that are out there, or continue to improve as we sort of talked about with basically CoinSwap. There's things that can be done. I'm certainly still here. I'm not giving up. And that's as someone who actively does these types of analyses.
Great. And also, I think there's an interesting implication coming out of some of your work here where it's sort of like exchanges are kind of being used to quote unquote whitewash or bless and cleanse the so-called dirty coins of large exchanges. And in some ways, a skeptic of the chain surveillance companies might say, well, are they kind of selling snake oil here? Because they're the ones who were meant to be catching this stuff and their tool sets were meant to stop this sort of behavior. And yet it has happened, right?
Yeah. As long as we still live in the real world, there will be people that will need to cash out to fiat at some point. And the surveillance firms, they like to push the concept of taint. 6102 has done some great infographics on taint that everyone should go check out. I consider taint to be, snake oil. It's a scary term that, again, some of the sort of privacy maximalist types will cling on to and say, you're going to get tainted coins if you use CoinJoin or you use, some type of service. And, I think that we've done a pretty good job or at least 6102 has done a good job of documenting how that's, basically a flawed concept. But, kind of at the end of the day, whether or not taint is kind of a flawed concept is, these surveillance firms, they're applying these proprietary risk scores to transactions, to and from different services, regardless of the concept of taint. Coins that come in and out of certain services are going to get a higher subjective risk score, and the way that they sort of carry that risk across subsequent transactions is something that we don't entirely know, how that's done. We can listen to, their webinars. We can listen to some of the information that they're put out there, and kind of keep the caveat in the back of our mind that this is they're not incentivized to be open about what they do. This is kind of an information war where we in the open source community are at a disadvantage because all of our technology, all of the software that we use, it's accessible to anyone. And we're bumping up against the kind of legacy system, which is basically being built with this proprietary risk scoring. It certainly is an issue. What these guys are trying to do. Absolutely, I agree that they're sort of creating their own problems that they can solve. It sort of seems that they've been hinting at kind of recently this new kind of concept of last known origin or last known destination, where coins are basically given some type of a blessing if they come from some kind of a trusted exchange. And a trusted exchange is an exchange that likely works directly with whichever surveillance firm, or isn't part of whatever kind of network of surveillance firms that shares information. And everywhere else is sort of given this this non-blessing, I guess maybe is a way to put it. We'll have to see how things sort of progress from here. But I've noticed a lot of the surveillance firms' recent reports have been absolutely pushing KYC pretty hard. A lot of the themes of their research, almost always circles back to, well, local Bitcoins is bad or OTC is bad. Everyone needs to use a KYC exchange so that we can, prevent money laundering. And I don't see that letting up anytime soon.
Right. And so listeners who are, I guess, well, first off, take your unblessed coins elsewhere, you pleb. Yeah. That's kind of the mindset that we're getting from them. And so listeners, make sure if you haven't already, go back and listen to my episode with Raphael Jacobi, where we talk about some of those concepts as well. I'm also interested to get your thoughts on whether we might see, well, let's say, okay, so the analysis is getting better and better, but also are criminals going to get better? Are they going to start using Samourai Whirlpool? And are they, what's going to happen? Is it a matter of time, in your view, until, let's say, some scammer criminal goes and uses Samurai Whirlpool to try and mix their coins.
Yeah, I kind of think it's a matter of time. I mean, we've seen them use, Wasabi. We've seen Plus Token go through Wasabi. In our latest, report, we talk about, the conspirators, or at least someone that's likely associated with a darknet market, has been providing a lot of liquidity to Wasabi. I, you kind of have to, look at it from, at least here's the way I look at it, which is that, if Bitcoin and Coinjoins don't provide, sufficient privacy for, today's labeled criminals, I worry that, it won't be able to provide, the privacy that even normal people that aren't looking to break the law, in the future, the kind of privacy that they need. Today, right now, they might not be, labeled as generic criminals, but with some of the recent turmoil that we've seen kind of across the world, the term criminal and terrorist has been getting thrown around, a lot more liberally than it used to. Where people are sort of, or government agencies are basically now sort of unilaterally deciding who is a criminal and who is not a criminal. So just because, right now we might consider, darknet market vendors criminals, if those people feel like they're not getting the privacy and the censorship resistance that they need, from Bitcoin, they're ultimately going to move somewhere else. So if those people start using or continue to use non-custodial CoinJoin services, I think that's a good sign. It means that Bitcoin's providing the censorship resistance that they need.
Bullish on CoinJoins, hey? Well, lastly, I was also keen to ask, this is kind of unrelated, but just out of curiosity, this crazy 101. So for listeners who are unfamiliar, recently, pre the difficulty adjustments, we had a lot of full blocks because basically blocks are coming out slower, meaning that they were a lot more full. And then the men who stare at the mempool and others who are doing chain analysis were noticing that there was this entity putting out these like really high fee consolidation transactions. And so Laurent MT was talking on Twitter and he named this entity Crazy 101. So do you have any thoughts on that, and have you had a chance to look into that?
Yeah, we've started looking into this entity a little bit. Zigamon had brought this to our attention, as you had kind of laid out. We recently had the halving. We saw a significant amount of, hash rate sort of come offline as unprofitable miners were turned off. And right around the same time, we saw an entity that was, doing these massive consolidation transactions and paying very, very high fees. They were taking one-of-one multi-sig inputs and consolidating them, into, transactions typically with 3 outputs. And paying, again, a very high fees. And for, I think a lot of, your listeners will be a little bit aware of the purpose of multi-sig. I don't really know of a purpose of a one-of-one multi-sig. I can't think of, very many reasons that would be used, for anything. So, they sort of were creating, expensive transactions. Very expensive transactions, and over a couple week period, it looks like they paid about 100 BTC in miner fees, which is at today's prices $1 million, all from a single entity. So Laurent ran a little bit of a custom algorithm to try to get a handle on a cluster of Crazy 101. And we've seen some links to some exchanges, some of the typical people that are typical entities that aren't really very good stewards of the block space. But we'll have to dig into it a little bit further to try to figure out who and why this was going on. I mean, it would almost seem like some type of custom script that had gone awry. But if something like that had happened, you would figure that after they realized how much they were paying in miner fees, they would have shut this thing down. But it continued for several weeks, and again, 100 BTC in mining fees from a single entity is pretty crazy. So we're not quite sure to make it out of it yet. It's an interesting case that we'll be taking a look at.
I guess the miners are happy, right? That's more money for the miners. So silver lining there for the miners, that is. So I guess, actually, is there anything else you're kind of watching closely, or what are you sort of looking at in terms of research?
I keep seeing, the Ponzi scams keep coming up from some of the mainstream chain analysis firms. I may have to do another report on Plus Token and some of the other, recently rediscovered scams like Woe Token. We saw in the CipherTrace report that was released for Q2 about a week or so ago, they had some mention of Woe Token, and they provided a transaction graph that was very, I guess again another term for these types of analyses that we see from the mainstream is opaque. It was basically just a transaction graph. It didn't even say which coin it was. Was it Bitcoin or was it Ethereum? Was it something else? And they were implying that these coins were still sort of moving. So I keep seeing this sort of clickbait junk go by from the mainstream. So I think probably my next report will be on, a little update on Plus Token and talk briefly about some of these other Ponzi's. And, then we'll sort of just keep it kind of opportunistic. I mean, we didn't expect to see the IRS come by with, something that we could kind of, sink our teeth into. But, as this stuff kind of comes up, we'll be around to take a look at it.
That's awesome. I think you guys are doing great work. I really enjoyed reading these 2 reports that you put out recently, and of course enjoyed discussing with you. So Ergo, where can people find you online, and where can they get the reports?
You can check out research.oxt.me, which is where all the reports are available. Again, check out oxt.me, our block explorer. Normal users would do well to take a look into some of this stuff to learn about, kind of improving their own privacy. And other than that, I guess you can give me a shout on Twitter. I'm around. And that's about it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me, Ergo.
Thank you, Stephan.
Get the show notes at stephanlivera.com/179. That's it from me. I'll see you guys in the Citadels.